the question actually to ask is whether this was something that was a matter for the Russians, that is a matter of last resort for the Russians.
Right, yeah.
And when you ask that question, that would be the right question according to me.
We have with us today Sri Sanjay Dixit, who is one of the most visible and prominent Indic and Hindu voices today. I'd like to welcome you, Sanjay ji.
Thank you, and namaste to everyone.
So Sanjay ji, let's begin with one of the most fascinating aspects when it comes to yourself, your journey from being in the Merchant Navy, then the Indian Administrative Services, and now a well-known social and political commentator. You have had stints even with the Rajasthan Cricket Board, for that matter, and this journey has been quite singular. So what motivated you along your journey?
Well, I think I take a journey as a journey. as Bhagavad Gita would tell you, that a journey is a journey. And as we tell our budding cricketers during cricket coaching, concentrate on the process and not on the results. Because if you start concentrating too much on the results, then other things would come into play. And that's exactly what Bhagavad Gita would teach you, Karmarnyeva adhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. And of course, it is also quite misunderstood. It doesn't mean that you do not aspire for the fruits. Of course, you have to have a target, but you do not command the fruits. So I think that's how I just went along.
That's very beautiful, yeah. And I think that's very important and relevant for today's age. Coming to a recent, and I'll be coming to the Jaipur Dialogues in a bit, which has been one of the most path-breaking initiatives in terms of, defining the narrative and defining the discourse when it comes to Sanatan Dharma. But before I come to that, something which is very relevant right now, the Ukraine conflagration, and you have recently you released a video, which, on the same, a few interactions. So the ongoing conflagration has been in the news, and Russia is obviously wary of the increasing NATO influence in Ukraine. Donbass has been part of a violent civil war for 8 years. Neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion are, present and have grown. But does any of that justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has left thousands dead and more than 1 million people displaced?
See, an invasion is an invasion. You look for justifications for the invasion. I think there's never been an invasion in the world history that can be justified as such, because everybody would say, okay, violence is avoidable. But then is there a justification for the Mahabharata war? That's the counter question that I would like to ask anybody. But then that was actually the Pandavas were actually coaxed into and persuaded into joining that war. Because there comes a time when that is the matter of last resort. And the question actually to ask is whether this was something that was a matter for the Russians, that is a matter of last resort for the Russians.
Right, yeah.
And when you ask that question, that would be the right question according to me.
Right.
And maybe it wasn't a matter of the last resort. They could have waited some more time. But then there is never a perfect invasion, as we all know. Had there been a perfect invasion, Hitler would never have lost, because he had calculated everything. Mm-hmm. And so there is never a perfect war. There is never a perfect invasion. But if you look at it from the point of view of the Russians, I think the way they had been treated by the West when they actually wanted to westernize. They wanted to join the West, and they were spurned. And not only they were spurned, they were actually plundered. In fact, just yesterday, I was talking to, in fact, that particular video was removed by YouTube. I take it as a salute to Jaipur Dialogues by the YouTube. We have arrived. Right. Because one of our video was taken down. Luckily, it was restored on appeal. But then I gave out some facts, and I took Tariq Fatehji back to an address that was made by Putin to the Russian parliament. And he said that he blamed who all? He blamed the communists. He blamed the elites. Who are these elites? These elites were the ones, the Russian elites, who were pampered, encouraged, and husbanded by the US and the West and by the Wall Street. And what was the result? The result was a complete impoverishment of the Russian population.
Right.
Between 1990 and 1999, the globalists, the Wall Street, they encouraged, in fact, they kind of pioneered some kind of a capitalist revolution in Russia, which resulted in their GDP going down by 40%. And their per capita income going down by more than 50%. And resulting in what is called a per capita income of something like $1,320, which at that point of time was probably less than India's. And that was all done under the capitalist watch here, because they were actually leading the Russian economy by hand. They were guiding the Russian economy. So Russia wanted to join NATO at one point of time when they went back on their promises, and they made Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary join the NATO. Yes. At that time, Russia also applied. Yeah. Russia was spurned. So what was the big game going on? It's the same game that has been going on, that same colonial imperialist game that has been going on for well nigh 3 or 4 centuries. So where does that leave Russia? In fact, I admire Putin that he called it out. Somebody lesser would probably have deterred and would have again thrown Russia to the wolves, because in the Putin years from 1999 onwards, in these 23 years, he has brought Russia from a 190 billion economy to a 2.1 trillion economy. He has taken the per capita income of the Russians from $1,320 to $14,800. And somebody who's done that, he's not going to be hated by the Russians, as the US and the West seem to assume. They seem to think that by bringing sanctions, they will impoverish Russia. Whatever sanctions they might bring on, Russians are never going to lose 40% GDP, maybe 1%, 2% here or there. So that's about all. Right. So I have a completely different take. Right. All this moral principles about war, not for me. When it comes to defending your dharma, then if you have to go to war, you do go to war. As simple as that.
Today, there was the movement of the Russian kind of market and then the forces, because Visa and MasterCard, after their exit, I think it has moved towards Chinese, entities, and that's a question in itself. You also raised a very...
They're also going for rupee, not just the Union Pay of China.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, and you also raised a very important, observation, which the viewers some of them may know, but it's not quite widely known that Russia did apply for NATO, and there was a rejection of sorts from the NATO forces at one point. And there has been this, this tussle of sorts, even on the Finland question. There were, Poland, Hungary, and various other aspects as such. But in this current configuration, Russia has openly challenged the unipolar nature of international geopolitics today, with Taliban regaining Afghanistan and a history of military misadventures by the United States, such as in Iraq. Are we seeing the end of days when NATO, particularly the US, could unilaterally decide the fate of various nations and people without being checked?
Days of NATO are over, quite clearly. Right. And they're themselves to blame for that. And why should NATO have existed? Why did NATO come about? NATO came about because of the Cold War. Right. And once the Cold War had been ended by mutual agreement. Russia was a party to the end of Cold War. After all, the German reunification was achieved with Russia's consent. Yes. The dissolution of the USSR took place with Russia's consent. And those consents also had something of the aspiration of the Russians. They thought that they would be integrated into the global economic system and they would get a fair deal for sacrificing so much. and for enabling the West to write things like the end of history. Well, obviously, the end of history, what they meant was not just the end of history, but the annihilation of Russia. Was clearly, if the Russia doesn't want itself to be annihilated and wants to push back, I can't blame Russia.
Right, right. And you mentioned in one of your responses right now about this, the weaponization of, there has been an information warfare and a certain sanction-based, even sanctions for that matter. So weaponization of information, media, and finances has been used as a new form of warfare by the West, which is desperate to kind of check Russia's advances in Ukraine. More closer to home, I mean, this whole weaponization of information, media, and finances, particularly in India, given that we have the general election coming in 2024, there are various forces under the surface which are problematic, which may, really unsettle things. How do you think we as Indians, we as a people, can be prepared for this shadow offensive, if one could call it that, given the upcoming definitive events that are supposed to happen in the country?
Well, they're trying that everywhere.
Right.
They're trying that right now with Russia. Russia reacted, luckily. Yeah. They tried that with Yugoslavia. And Breaking India, as Rajiv Ji's famous book says, has been a project for nearly 2 centuries. Right. We know that it's been a very, very important project for the West. Yes. And they did manage to break India. And they have broken it into 3 parts, but their real aspiration is to break it into 18 parts, as that famous Gangadhar Adhikari thesis proposed. Yeah. And the only thing that the Western hegemons, I call them hegemons, because everything that they talk about, whether they talk about freedom of speech or free markets or freedom of expression or intellectual freedom, academic freedom, everything is geared towards one goal. And right. That one goal is to establish a neo-imperialistic hegemony right. all over the world. The globalization project was one such. And of course, China was smart enough to actually turn it around. Right. and make a complete ass of these profit-loving Americans. But the effort to treat everybody else outside their sphere of influence, to treat everybody else as either a client state or a potential client state, and if it doesn't fit into these two, then to treat it as a rogue state, has always been the fulcrum of all US and Western policies. And that we have been a witness to that from 1830s. And the leaders who inherited the mantle after the British left, they continued that same policy because I don't think they had the self-confidence or the self-esteem to actually analyze these tendencies and these policies and to face them squarely or let alone turn them around. And we've seen that happen for a good 60 years. The last 8 years have actually been some kind of a, I would say, just maintaining that status quo, not letting things worsen, but there hasn't been a pushback yet. But I'm quite happy to note that finally the situation may arise where India would be forced to push back. And for that, we have to thank Putin.